So I would like to welcome you all to our first official Framing Aging webinar. As you know, under normal circumstances, we would have met in Dublin at the UCD Humanities Institute today and tomorrow to kind of discuss framing aging from an interdisciplinary perspective. But of course, COVID-19 has scuppered this, so we are now rolling out turning this conference into a series of webinars. Now, today's webinar, as you know, has two panels. The first one focuses on aging bodies and identities, but just to say that I'm delighted to see you all in close-up at a distance, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussions today and in the coming weeks. And just a reminder that today's webinar will be followed by the second one on the 15th of December, which has a strong focus on narrating age. But we'll circulate more information about that later on.
So to start, I would like to show you my 3 favorite portraits of 18th century centenarians. All 3 of them are drawn after life and represent typical 18th century positive attitudes towards aging. These centenarians are also part of a thriving 18th century centenarian cult that emphasized the renewed vigor of extreme old age. I use the word centenarian cult in a positive way, taking seriously tales about lively and incredibly fit people in their 4th age. In doing so, I move away from Peter Leslet's original definition, which centered on irrational beliefs and the uncontrolled fantasy in claims to extremely long life. And you see here a few quotes on the screen. In this short paper, I argue that in 18th century centenarian tales, there is more at stake than disenchanting centenarians through the verification of true ages. It is far more interesting to question how these tales represent the socio-cultural framing of aging. And here I want to discuss 3 issues. The regeneration of teeth, the celebration of a peasant lifestyle, and the importance of cold climates. Let me start with the first, the regeneration of teeth. Many centenarian stories speak of improved eyesight and the regeneration of hair and teeth. In particular, the latter has intrigued me ever since working on the history of healthy aging. Today, we would consider a 3rd set of teeth absolutely impossible. When I asked my dentist neighbor, he argued that surely these people must have mistaken dentures for the real thing. But I suggest that regenerated teeth signify medical ideas about the body's store of vital powers. These ideas dovetail with the trope of the fountain of youth. In pre-modern Europe, the loss of teeth was perhaps the most serious consequence of growing old. It transformed eating and diet, it seriously affected speaking, and it changed appearances. Surgeon William Bennett stated in 1779 that, quote, the loss of a tooth is of so much consequence to the owner that it should never be consented to. Bennett nowhere spoke of the possibility of growing a 3rd set of teeth, but Pierre Fauchard, who is considered the 18th century father of modern dentistry, had observed it on several occasions. And he argued that, quote, large molars regenerate not merely once, but sometimes twice. This fact is incontestable. Large molars may regenerate at any time. The regeneration of teeth, and indeed of every part of the body, was related to medical ideas about the body's natural store of vital forces, which gradually decreases over the course of a lifetime. The natural growth of extremities in old age was considered a sign of exceptional vigor. Vitality and teeth were even connected before birth. It was said that sometimes people have so much vitality they cut their teeth before birth. For instance, King Louis XIV of France was born into the world with teeth. Physicians often referred to the cultural trope of the fountain of life in order to understand the working of vital spirits in the blood. For instance, Benjamin Grosvenor pointed at the blood as an internal fountain of life that conveys the life-giving water to every leaf and to every fiber. Dutch medical teacher Herman Boerhaave likewise argued that, quote, the vital powers protrude teeth and hair from within outwards. And Francis Spilberry stated that, quote, a third set of teeth sometimes makes its appearance about 70 or 80 years of age, as though nature strove to renew youth. In short, the regeneration of teeth in centenarians pointed at an exceptionally big store of vital forces that triggered a continuous process of rejuvenation. Another aspect always mentioned in centenarian stories is the healthy simplicity of an agricultural lifestyle. Of Thomas Parr, who was said to have lived for 152 years, it was said that, quote, good wholesome labor was his exercise and that he spent his days in mire and toiling sweats. The idealization of an agricultural lifestyle resulted from concerns over the negative effects of affluent lifestyles. Physicians and other societal improvers posed the image of the overweight gentleman suffering from gout against the myth of the fortunate poor. For example, physician James Mackenzie wrote that, quote, the poor, if they are virtuous and cleanly, have great advantages over the rich with respect to health and long life, as the narrowness of their circumstances prompts them to labor and withdraws all temptations to luxury. Agricultural work was considered healthy because it hardened the muscles and reduced the flesh. Isaac Fuller's personification of exercise, and you see it here on the screen, represents this image of the healthy peasant. And centenarians with peasant lifestyles were similarly framed as a warning against the dangers of luxury lifestyles, encouraging manual work and exercise in aid of longevity. It was often explicitly mentioned that centenarians lived in the cold climates of northern European countries. Scandinavia was often mentioned, but also the Netherlands, northern Germany, the Scottish Highlands, and indeed Ireland. This is remarkable. In classical humoral pathology, cold was closely and negatively associated with old age. Winter was usually represented by an old man warming his hands and feet at the fire. And in medical practice, approaching death could be identified with cold limbs and a cold breath. Cold sweats were considered symptomatic of the most dangerous fevers. During the 18th century, as a result of new medical ideas on fibers, cold was increasingly considered a good thing. For instance, Herman Boerhaave distinguished between internal cold, which was always a sign of bad health, and the blessings of cold weather. He argued that during winter the grounds are frozen and bad vapors cannot rise to the surface of the earth. More importantly, when cold weather makes you feel cold, the vital powers have to work harder in order to generate internal heat. This would shorten and strengthen the fibers and increase a healthy circulation of the humours. This process could be sped up through the typical Dutch sport of skating. Boerhaave, in other words, was convinced that the Dutch are healthiest and strongest in the severest of winters. Medical professor Wouter van Doeveren stated that those who often complain about the weather are at a loss. Severe cold is not harmful, but rather beneficial to health. There also was a strong issue of national pride here. Just like the ancients had argued that the Mediterranean climate created superior strength and intellect, just so 18th century Northern Europeans believed that cold and miserable weather strengthened the nation. People were strong and forced to be cooperative, tolerant, and inventive. In that sense, reports on centenarians boasted national pride, as they were essentially about the strength of Northern European constitutions. To conclude, the centenarian cult was important in the 18th century and is still important today. The media still regularly reports of the vitality of centenarians. Admittedly, we don't read about things like the regeneration of teeth, yet our tales are as much about the social cultural framing of aging as they were in the 18th century. They not only narrowly represent what we value in old age, but perhaps even more importantly, they also show how centenarians epitomize what we think is important in life, how we understand health, and how we structure society. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. I'm going to ask Professor Walsh to come in now as respondent.
Okay, thanks very much, Mary, and thank you, Rina, for such an interesting paper. I have no idea if my responses are appropriate to what was originally intended for the event, but they are framed in some of the work that I would typically do around social exclusion policy and different contexts as well. So, Rina, if your paper and if my interpretation is anyway correct, certainly I would see your paper as illuminating a lot of really pertinent dimensions and debates that are not just about framing aging, but about understanding aging experiences and how we might need to take some of these elements into account in the policy sphere. So for me, there are three main messages that are really emerging. The first is really our long-standing interest in longevity and the ways that our construction and preservation of and admiration for some of those ideals are present in contemporary discourses. And certainly, as you've done so yourself, you can map these elements directly onto our orientating policy concepts of healthy and active aging, which are pervasive in age-related policy and practice and advocacy discourses as well. And in some ways, this in part helps to really explain why in many jurisdictions, aging and the version of older people that we construct remain very much rooted in the health domain. And I suppose the last 8 months of the COVID-19 pandemic has, if anything, has really reinforced that. And I suppose the question then is, what do we miss because of that framing? So our economic, cultural, social, and civic lives, or our bodily civic lives, become more neglected and than they should be, and perhaps also, as is the policy and practice solution spaces that they may offer as well. So in Rina's representation, though, of the cult of centenarians, or at least in your interpretation of it, you can certainly point to broader notions of vitality connected to purpose, which is really important, and work-life trajectories and the environment. Which certainly can be argued that we have not yet fully embraced in our own agendas today in some policy spheres as well. Second, I suppose Rina's paper illustrates how inequalities can come to the fore and the ways in which we as societies and cultures can mask unequal experiences of aging through discourses that relate to notions of resilience, stoicism, and healthily bodily active labor. So positionings such as these have been evident and harnessed in various contexts and function to lift some of the responsibility for poverty, deprivation, and even indeed solidarity from the shoulders of our communities and societies. Then the lack of longevity, the lack of vitality almost becomes independent of these structural conditions and more likely viewed as a product of some individual deficiency or even moral weakness. So this certainly echoes the work of Peter Townsend, of René Lenoir and Ruth Levitas in recent years, but also the ideas of the moral underclass. But in listening to Rina's paper, it's hard not to think about debates around retirement ages and extended working life policies present across European and international contexts. And particularly, we often hear about the weight of the evidence that is there about extending working life into later life. But also, there is now a counter argument about the increasing recognition of the negative health and gender impacts of such policies with more precarious work-life trajectories and physically demanding labor. So I think in some ways that certainly popped up in your paper as well, which is really good. Third, and this is my final message, I guess, and I might be going slightly tangential to your analysis here, but certainly it suggests to me that the cult of centenarians points us to the importance of processes around meaning making in the context of our environments in later life. And the emphasis on environmental conditions and labouring the ground reminds me of work we conducted in Ireland and Northern Ireland around social exclusion in later life in rural areas, and how notions around invested effort, the aesthetic and functional landscape were fundamental to identity and the sense of being in and belonging to place. And certainly we're very much rooted within that idea and oriented around that idea of bodily interaction with environment as well. So this gives us a little bit more of a pointer perhaps to what we should be focusing upon in later life and indeed policy, and about opportunities to create really meaningful ways of engaging for making and remaking meaning as we age. So my final element is really just to reinforce Rina's point that I think we should very much take this cult of centenarians very seriously, and to look at how it can illuminate new possible areas of inquiry for policy and for aging research into the future, and certainly be a little bit better at guiding us in that respect as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for that. And I'll move on to the next speaker and next respondent. So our second speaker today is Paul Higgs, Professor of the Sociology of Aging at University College London. And our respondent is Dana Walrath, a writer, artist, and anthropologist who's worked on dementia and is a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Equity in Brain Health at the Global Brain Health Institute, Trinity College Dublin, and University of California, San Francisco. And Professor Higgs's paper today is, well, the aging body and the social imaginary of the fourth age is what I will call it. Yes, exactly, that's what it is. Thank you, Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. And I want to talk very much about the framing of old age. And the title of my talk is going to draw, for many of those who know, on work that I've done with Chris Gilliard on the idea of the fourth age and its status as a social imaginary. What I want to do today, though, is actually be a little bit provocative and respond to some of the moves that have been occurring in social gerontology about the role of the aging body in the construction of the fourth age. Because I think that one of the things that has been preoccupying gerontologists over the last 9 months has been the kind of the return of the aging body into public policy, and particularly in the pandemic. And so what I want to do is to talk a little bit about how the body itself, as corporeality, is important in understanding later life and not just something that is a social construction. Now, this saying or maxims attributed to the vizier, to the pharaoh in the 5th dynasty, in 24th century BC, is, I suppose, a nod to the fact that this is a conference that is, sharing ideas between the social sciences and the humanities. And what I wanted to say in this quote is that over history, there has been a long acknowledgement that growing older has a negative consequence, irrespective of how well positioned you might be in society. I won't go through the quote, but as you can see, it doesn't kind of endorse old age. And it is actually a plea from the vizier to the pharaoh to just let him rest, let him retire, because he's finding being old not a very pleasant experience. Now, in some senses, this has been a common historical understanding of old age for, literally millennia. But what I want to kind of focus on is how does it relate to the distinction that is becoming more and more used in social gerontology between the third and the fourth age. And obviously, the previous speaker talked about Laslet's idea of the fourth age. And there are different ways of conceptualizing the fourth age. We've seen that it features in the work of the Baltes. We see it features in a number of different approaches, that there is an oldest old group for whom later life is challenging. The approach to the fourth age that Chris Gilliard and I myself have developed is slightly different in that we want to talk about it as a social imaginary rather than a chronological category or one that's demarcated by social policy. Rather, that we wanted to talk about it as a contrast between the third age, the idea that contemporary old age has turned into later life, and that in some senses that the third age, as we conceptualize it, has been seen as something like an ageless aging, in which the vicissitudes of old age can be kept at bay. Now, what is important about our use of the term social imaginary is the idea that contemporary old age is in some senses marked out by the social imaginary, which actually contains a surplus of significations which in some sense is linked to unconscious processes whereby the majority of the population will put older people at a distance to themselves. This idea of othering is well known in many different disciplines and in different approaches, but it is the fact that we are aware that old age is othered from the rest of the life course, and that in understanding that, we need to therefore understand how that is rooted, how aging is rooted in vulnerability and frailty, and that this is fundamental to the social imaginary of the fourth age. It's fundamental to the othering of old age. Now, in the work that Chris and I have done, we talk about the social imaginary, not, as I said, as a chronological category or as one that can be defined by assessment tools, but rather it's affected by four vectors. And we see these vectors as, in the following list. First of all, by frailty. Now, it's interesting that frailty has become a very rigorous arena of assessment in geriatric medicine. But it is interesting that frailty has a much wider remit than just talking about a scale that can be used to assess someone's inner strength or their possibility of dying. And that frailty, in some senses, is something that is culturally understood, that somebody is very, very poor health, disabled, and is likely to die. Secondly, it's the abjection of later life, particularly the abjection of the nursing home and of people who have got cognitive impairment, that in some senses, if the fear of the workhouse was that dominated the 19th century, the fear of the nursing home is that which dominates the late 20th and early 21st century. And that in that there is an abject class that is, in some senses, seen as, again, othered from the rest of the population. Crucially, this abjection and frailty are also present in the idea of a loss of agency. In our paper on where we're trying to think out the theory of the fourth age, we subtitled it the aging without agency. And in contemporary society, where the premium is put on choice and self-actualization and agency, the fear of moving from a first-person narrative to a third-person narrative, where people make decisions on your behalf, is very, very frightening. And so consequently, we argue that part of the, the constellation of ideas that make up the social imaginary of fourth age, one of them is the loss of agency. And that this in turn invokes what we call the imperative to care. But in some senses, that whilst we are aware that old age is no longer synonymous with disability and infirmity, we are also aware that as we get much older, on average, we are in greater need of forms of care. And the imperative to care is something that all societies are dealing with, but that they're all finding solutions that seem to be ones that do not put the older person at the heart, but rather solve social problems. Now, as I've tried to point out, that when we're talking about the social imaginary of the fourth age, it's not that we're talking about something that is easy to grasp. In fact, as I mentioned, it sets up a constellation of representations in which old age and its ontological status are situated. What the fear for many people as they grow older is that they are going to fall into the fourth age, that they are going to be seen as frail, as lacking in agency and needing care. And ultimately, they may fear being abject. Now, one of the things that can be thrown at such an approach is that these representations therefore create the problems that older people face. Well, we would argue that such representations have existed throughout history. They are rooted in the corporeality of the aging body, but they are not in any way total or all-encompassing. And so it is possible to actually talk about the social imaginary of the fourth age without necessarily ignoring the fact that some people escape aspects of it, or that in fact that they can actually have good quality lives, irrespective of the social imaginary of the fourth age. What we're trying to argue is that the social imaginary of the fourth age has a presence in the cultural understanding of contemporary aging. It effectively frames the older parts of life, and therefore has to be taken into consideration if we're thinking about understanding old age in contemporary society. So my takeaway message from this presentation is that we have to see not only the fourth age as having a presence in people's lives, but that it is actually important to see the role of corporeality in creating the social imaginary of the fourth age. There has been a long history of understanding it. And that part of the polemic in this presentation is that this argument is set up in opposition to what has become described as decline ideology. The idea that if we use the idea of aging, it becomes instantly ageist. And I'm thinking here of the work of Margaret Gillette. And I think it's very interesting, the shift from aging studies to age studies. And this is in some senses partly because of the idea that aging itself is something we should resist in discussing. We should see it as just kind of a set of different outcomes. I think that that when we adopt such positions, we end up reifying or avoiding the ontological fears present in later life, as if they are just purely socially constructed. You know, I would argue that the social imaginary of the fourth age frames later life, but does not see it as a pure social construction. It is actually something that is a dialectic between corporeality and society. Therefore, by using the social imaginary of the fourth age as a lens, we can actually recognize the complexity of aging and not reduce it to a simple discourse or a totalizing concept such as ageism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. Dana, if I could ask you to step in now with your response.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Paul, for a very interesting exploration. Yes, I agree. The dominant cultural and historical processes pattern a really negative view of growing older. And I'm grateful that we're collectively taking on that master narrative of life course decline here as part of reframing aging. You bring in Tahotep and his words to show this time depth of negative beliefs. And throughout your presentation, you use the phrase without history or throughout history. I'm echoing Rina's presentation that's showing the 17th century approach or 18th century approach to aging in the cult of centenarians. For me, though, as an anthropologist, my time frame is deeper, and it's not so completely locked into sort of the Western dominant narrative. And so I want to put out the idea that this approach that we have now with aging as that we have to fear this decline and dependency and fear death as something that is innately human, I want to say it's very specifically culturally produced, but on a scale of when the earliest civilizations started. And I want us to be able to go back deeper and deeper into time, because I'm not so sure that states were, older states were so devalued until we began reckoning the value of individuals solely in terms of economics. And in terms of human history, that's a very recent phenomenon. Our evolutionary history dates back hundreds of thousands of years, way before Tahotep and anyone else, if not millions, where we lived in multi-age social groups, where we cared for one another. We were dependent on one another. We didn't think of one another in terms of our economic value. And historical accounts, because our earliest writings were all based on forms of exchange and monetary systems. Those are also linked. So I would encourage us to go back as we reframe aging and we take apart this master narrative, to really just wonder, what's wrong with dependency? What's wrong with death? It's a natural part of life. And how can we restructure things so that we can embrace all of those parts of life? I really appreciate how you brought it back to the concept of embodiment. And I want to just share screen for a moment and show you how we think about bodies and embodiment within anthropology, and just use an image. In anthropology, when we talk about bodies, instead of just that physical body, which is the focus of allopathic medicine and is the focus in all these discussions of frailty, and it is the way that people are thinking about decline, it's so locked in to a medical system, allopathic medicine, or otherwise known as biomedicine, which is based on repairing and manipulating individual physical bodies, much the way our dominant social forms manipulate and extract and control nature. That's only one way to think of the body, but it is so tied into medicine, it's so tied into health, that here we are in a pandemic and we have more people oriented around finding the vaccine than thinking about how can we restructure society so that we're not, or societies reconstruct the world order altogether, so that we're not continually making new diseases that we continually have to fight with other sorts of aggressive, expensive, wasteful means that are ultimately going to undo the world in another way. So this brings in those other two bodies. And you can see in this funny drawing that they're interconnected, they're nesting the way things are in evolutionary theory. So there's the physical body right there in the center. And then around it is the social body that gives meaning to all those physical conditions. The social body is where the othering that you described so well takes place, you know, the othering of aging. It's whether we say yes to it or whether we say no, keep me away from it, that's so scary. The social body is always giving meaning, but that meaning, as I tried to link at the very beginning, is completely derived from the political body. So that's the political and economic forces that determine who gets sick and who gets well and how all of that happens. And so if we use this kind of three body format, it is very parallel to sort of the notions of the social imaginary, but it locks in all those political forces. And I think it also makes room for us to liberate ourselves from really being locked into historical and Western ways of thinking about all of this that are tied in completely into preventing death. So that one of the key things that we can do is make return to making death a natural part of life. Have medicine not just be all about preventing death. And again, let's use the pandemic. Look at how so early on in the pandemic, and as was true the first time that we met as a group, we were having people, you know, die alone in rooms without any other social contact because we were so afraid, or any social contact with their loved ones, because we were so focused on preventing death that we lost track of the bigger picture. And then again, look at the pandemic and how it utterly revealed who was dying. I mean, we saw it especially brutally in my country, where it was Black and brown people who were disproportionately dying, and how we can use that whole frailty discourse to kind of say, well, racism is a real public health determinant. So I want to kind of, as we unpack all of this, really use not just physical embodiment, but social embodiment, political embodiment, and a really, really deep time frame that makes us aware of how things that we naturalize as the human condition aren't naturalized, but they're just socially produced. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dana. So moving to the last speaker and respondent in today's, in this first panel today. Our third speaker is Julia Twigg, Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at the University of Kent. And the respondent is Desmond Tobin, Professor of Dermatological Science at University College Dublin. Professor Twigg's paper is titled Age, Dress, and the Cultural Turn in Gerontology. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to this group, because I think it's really one of the really refreshing developments that have occurred in age studies over the last decade. The developments of new paradigms informed by a wider set of theories and methodological approaches. And these new sort of ways of thinking have bridged some of the traditional disciplinary boundaries that we've been caught in. Particularly, I think, the boundaries between the humanities and the social sciences. And I welcome particularly the growing interest within the humanities in the whole area of age, bringing in new theories, new methodologies. Now, there are lots of terms that have been used to characterize these sorts of developments: medical humanities, humanistic gerontology, aging studies. The term I tend to use is cultural gerontology. And in 2015, Wendy Martin and I, who's also speaking today, I'm very welcome to see, published the edited Routledge Handbook of Cultural Gerontology, which aimed to bring together a wealth of work on age by scholars across a number of disciplines. Cultural gerontology here is a broad term, but it can be understood essentially as aiming to explore the ways in which age is experienced and understood through and by cultural. And it focuses on the different cultural meanings that shape the nature and experience of later years. Now, that's not to deny physiological aging, and I take very much the point that Paul has made. Rather, it attempts to understand how a physiological nature is interpreted, experienced, and shaped by culture. And it treats culture as aging as part of culture, a certain aspect of the social world. It's achieved, I think, a number of significant intellectual shifts by doing this. One, it frees age and aging from narrow discourses in which it's too often been confined. I'm thinking here about the discourses of frailty and decline and of the public policy responses to these. Now, these are important subjects. I'm not trying to undermine their significance, but the key thing to say is that that's not all there is to say about later years or older age. Cultural gerontology approaches also, I think, just simply enrich the study of old age or later years. They avoid some of the implicit othering that's characteristic of traditional gerontology, and by placing the experiential, the narrative, the testimonial at the heart of work. And it can allow for things like the exploration of the visual, the artistic, incorporate materiality, and as well as meaning. Lastly, I think these sorts of approaches free up the boundaries of age studies, enabling processes of age and aging to be integrated back into mainstream analysis. Cultural gerontology treats age and aging as part of culture, and thus a central part of the social world. Age shouldn't be a marginal or neglected side topic, but is actually a central theme across the social sciences and humanities. And I think cultural gerontology aims to contribute to that shift in emphasis and in reach. Now, I want here to suggest that by looking at age, we have an example of the benefits of this kind of approach. Over the last decade, I've been engaged in work that looks at the role of clothing and dress in the cultural constitution of experience of age. I've undertaken a series of empirical studies. First was of older women, that's 55 plus, and their responses. Of the retail and design industry, having a consumption patterns, a quantitative study. Also, I've had more recently a parallel study of older men and dress that looks at the way their gendered experiences are different, but also similar. And lastly, I looked at the role of clothing in the lives of people with dementia. So trying essentially to extend these kind of cultural insights into that fourth age, which is often seen as devoid of that kind of analysis, something other than separate, as Paul has suggested. But I think, in fact, if you look at subjects like clothing, you have a reach across, a cultural reach across into those territory. Resonating through all these subjects have been themes of embodiment, gender, materiality, and meaning. Now, dress is not, I think, an obvious topic for age studies, but I think it's been a very fruitful one, and it offers a very good example of what can be gained from cultural approaches. I'd argue that dress, in fact, allows us to explore a number of key themes and debates within age studies. For example, recurringly, the complex interplay between bodily and cultural aging. How much of what we understand of old age is physiological and how much social and cultural? And I think dress helps us to pull out those sorts of tensions. Dress is very much about embodiment. It's the vestimentary envelope that surrounds the body and presents it to the social world. In this way, dress practices encode ideas about age. And we can illustrate this particularly in relation to cultural rules that have traditionally surrounded dress, and particularly in relation to women. I'm thinking here of the widespread practice of age ordering in dress, in which certain forms of dress are deemed appropriate for women as they age, or more significantly, inappropriate, for these are cultural codes that are traditionally expressed negatively in terms of what should be avoided, what you shouldn't wear, as it were. The ways of things that should be avoided: turnaround styles that expose the aging body, too low a neck, too short a skirt, or make overt claims to sexual attention, bright, sexy, look at me kind of clothes. These are the things that dress norms in relation to age tend to guide women away from. And it's part of a wider cultural process, social process, in which women find themselves becoming invisible. I think in this way, we need to recognize that dress is ideological. It's part of the processes whereby groups establish, sustain, and reproduce relations of dominance and subordination, and part of how those relations are made to appear natural, proper, legitimate. Now, we're accustomed to those kind of ideas in relation to class and gender, but surely this applies also to age, and I think we can see that resonating through ideas of age-appropriate dress. Clothes also open up the character of age as an identity, a degree to which we're perceived, ordered, judged by our position in an age hierarchy, and the ways in which this does and does not give meaning and shape to our lives. In this way, dress practices encodes norms about age. The focus on dress also allows us to explore the role of material culture, in this case, clothing, in supporting and undercutting identity, enabling us to perform and resist ideas about age. As such, it relates to the wider reconstitution of aging thesis, the idea that the nature and experience of later years has undergone a cultural shift in the last 40 years, particularly under the impact of consumption culture, and with that, the new discursive space that's opened up, that of the third age. And Paul's referred to the kind of ideology that gets connected with this third age, and this idea that aging can somehow be escaped from because of it's very much connected with that large economy of anti-aging. Dress also allows us to explore the moral regulation of age, the ways in which older bodies are policed and disciplined in distinctive ways. It can allow us to unpack the particular meanings and dangers attached to dereliction in dress. For such sartorial lapses in the old can signal a more general moral collapse, a threat of descent into pitiable, derelict old age. As a result, it can become important to maintain a certain standard of age if one's not to fall outside mainstream society, if one is not to cross this dangerous boundary between the third and fourth ages. This symbolic denigration, of course, is not a new phenomenon, but I think it's acquired additional significance with the emergence of new modes of governmentality in age and new disciplinary requirements that are linked to wider bodily perfection that increasingly marks the current consumption-mediated world. So I think what we're seeing in relation to later years are influences that are active and within younger age groups. Dress also allows us to explore the complex role of gender in relation to age, because dress is actually saturated with ideas about gender. And in the third study I undertook, looked specifically at the experiences of men. These were interesting contrast to the ways age impacted on women. Significantly, many of these differences reflected earlier differences in cultural codes and embodied meanings. For example, age anxiety around dress impacts earlier and more clearly in relation to women, reaching well back into middle years. Whereas for men, those erosive discourses are less significant, and they also don't occur at such a young stage. So this makes the point again that ideas about the different meanings of age, of dress in relation to age, tell us things about younger ages as well. So work in relation to age has a capacity to reach back earlier within the life course into the mainstream and contribute into mainstream analysis. Finally, in the work on dementia, we can once again see how clothing plays a potentially important part in the maintenance of identity, both for the person with dementia, offering a day-to-day concrete connection with the past, but also for relatives and carers, reminding of them who the person is and was. So again, these cultural ideas or these cultural forms of analysis can reach into the fourth age. They're not just related to that earlier third age stage of later life. So to conclude, I think dress has a capacity to refresh our analysis. It's an example of the wider paradigm shift of cultural gerontology. It offers a new lens through which to examine later years, focused on the ordinary, the everyday, and the experiential. It crosses the disciplinary divides, linking to new theorizing, for example, in relation to materiality or to literary and historical work. And most significantly, it integrates old age with the earlier stages of life, both marking out its distinctive qualities, but also through that integrating, resisting the traditional of marginalization and otherness. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that paper, Julia. Desmond, if I could ask you to step in with your response.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Anne, for inviting me to this conference. I feel a bit like an imposter here as a skin biologist who spends most of his time trying to reduce our skin of all ages into its cellular units in the lab. But here goes. I'm going to try and pick up on a few points that Julia mentioned about the saturation of gender via dress, but I think that you could also apply the display of skin for a lot of those comments as well. So I'll just show you my slide here and try to take you through where I think the physiology of skin is inevitably connected with culture, and the aging physiology of skin will bring changes to the way we see ourselves and therefore how others will see us as well. So obviously humans evolved under the sun, and our skin and how we clothe our skin and presented our body forms, particularly our skin, is very intricately linked with how our skin copes with the environment we live in, and predominantly in the context of the sun. And it has, as you can see in this National Geographic image at the top, where you can see the human family across all its visual types, really does impact on the climatic adaptation that we have with our bodies to the natural world, and what we do therefore in terms of its display and its covering in terms of age as well. So human skin can be divided very roughly into 6 types on the basis of how it copes with sun exposure, essentially whether it burns and never tans, and tans right up to it tans and never burns. And you can see in the image of the truck driver below the impact of sunlight on his skin, where I have in the center, sorry, on the left here, when he was driving next to one window on one side of the truck. The aging skin can be seen very dramatically on one side, and the other side very, very much unaffected. And if you imagine the skin without any sun, it would look like this. And if you replayed both sides, the skin damaged side on both sides of his face, you could see how that individual looks if they aged equally on both sides. And that just indicates the way we expose our skin to sun. And there's a gender aspect in this as well, in that depending on your geographic ancestry, your skin is more or less able to cope with the ravages of sun, principally through the melanin pigment. And therefore, the age profile or the perception of age can be very dramatically different. Here you can see an individual of African geographic ancestry and Northwest European ancestry, the exact same age, 80 years of age, but one face looks much, much younger. And therefore, if that was applied to the rest of their body, they may be much more at ease in its display in terms of showing how they felt about their age than another. There's also a very dramatic gender impact in the physiology of skin in terms of menopause, where there's a striking shift in hormones in women that occur at a much earlier age than in men. And this plays out dramatically in terms of how the skin will appear. That can be delayed a little bit with HRT, but essentially the skin will be very tightly connected to the hormonal balance of the individual as they age. And that might be reflected, therefore, in how they want to cover up the décolleté area of the neck, for example, and the upper chest. So you may see a change in that in terms of dress as individual ages. And then the sebum oil that lubricates the skin dramatically changes in terms of age, but much more early in women than in men. And then finish up with the more kind of the alert aspect of this in terms of cancer and the slight, the increasing perception of risk to life-limiting conditions that may be played out on the skin by nature of its interaction with the environment. And I show essentially the melanoma incidence on the top global picture there, but the one that's probably more relevant to this conference is the incidence of melanoma per body site in women versus men. And you can see that men do less well on the head because they tend to go bald. And if they're not wearing hats, that will be a problem. But women will do much less well in terms of the skin on their legs, which are typically more exposed in women than they would be in men. And I'm just using this example as just really to kind of indicate the traditional clothing styles for men and women in terms of the amount of skin that they display and how they will shift the balance of amount of skin they display with age is probably somehow connected with the visual changes in skin and the confidence that brings with it in terms of how we age, especially in a current time where the mediation around youthfulness is really targeted at one end of the aging spectrum. And that is probably then leading to this explosion of plastic surgery and all these other kind of discordant attempts to try, discordant in my opinion, I should say, attempts to try and present age in terms of displaying skin in a very different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Desmond. So we are running a little bit over time. I am aware of that, but I'd like to open up the panel now for discussion. If anyone would like to come in, you can, I think, raise your hand.
I have a comment.
Thank you.
And a kind of question for everyone. So Rina, when a few years ago, I came across a file of 18th century prints called English Remarkables, and there were centenarians in there. And there were also rope dancers, famous murderers, a famous sleeper, some dwarves. There were, like remarkable figures. And to me, it's interesting. You titled your talk "The Cult of the Centenarian," and I kind of questioned to what extent viewers, readers were supposed to believe in these figures. But in any event, kind of connecting to what Paul and Julia were talking about, this space of the social imaginary, it seems so narrow. Like Paul's working so hard to decouple it from just these physiological limitations, but it still seems to be along a continuum of just decline. Like it's so hard to break out of these just really, really narrow limitations around an imaginary. Whereas this early modern vision of the imaginary of old age is incredibly playful. I don't think it's just these models of virtue of extraordinary physiological capacity. I think that there's a kind of fairy tale quality to them, myths. Talk about a rich social imaginary. Now we can argue about the extent to which it's also a very like negative and it's that those are all these kinds of questions about, you know, historical horizons. But I guess I wonder whether these early modern models make us question the limits of our own contemporary social imaginaries.
I think that's a very, very good question, because one of the things that I think many people in the audience will know is that social imaginaries come in many different forms around many different kinds of topic. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to look at the fact that there used to be just an imaginary of old age, but what's actually happened. And I think it's an unusual formulation, but there is a social imaginary of a third age, which has actually expanded to mean that people can contemplate later life as something that is desirable. And in some senses, that connects with what you were describing about the early modern, or the late, you know, the early modern, the kind of period, and the imaginary of what is possible, because what people want is something that is desirable. But it's not that we can only have the desirable side. And this is where the discussions about even, you know, skin aging comes in. These things happen. People know that they happen and that they are connected to old age, and they are connected to deleterious things. I could have given you, and I'm sure many of the biogerontologists in the audience will know about, you know, Strehler's concept of aging. You know, he has 4 conditions, but one of the key things is it's deleterious and irreversible and leads to death. And I think that the social imaginary of the third age has kind of like led people to believe that you can have it all. But that's where then what Julia's talking about, the governmentality, comes in, because we want to continually talk about those people who are successful. We don't want to talk about those who are unsuccessful. So, you know, and again, social imaginary doesn't suggest that we disregard the other groups. It's just something that is there, so that we talk about nursing homes as the other, the people in the nursing homes, as in the COVID crisis, as the group who are expendable.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. There's another question coming in. I think David Troyansky would like to ask a question. So.
Hello, everyone. I really enjoyed it. My comment concerns the social imaginary operating in particular periods. And I wanted to say that what Rina finds with her centenarians looks a lot like what I found long ago when I was doing work on such representations in 18th century France. But historians of England tended to emphasize the coexistence of that maybe overly positive and deferential view with a very negative one, whereas I had seen a kind of shift from the sort of ridicule of old people to a more positive view. So I'm wondering if Rina sees both of those operating together. And I wanted to point out really quickly that what she says about teeth reminded me a bit of work by Colin Jones on what he calls the smile revolution in 18th century France, that you're talking about a kind of connection to the scientific or medical thinking of the time. And he does that too, but also sees a focus in portraiture on teeth and the smile that concerns all the ages of life, not so something you're describing is about old age, and something that you're describing is also about the whole life course. And there's a recent publication by some French historians on the 120-year-old man who dies in 1790. This is Antoine de Bec and Jacques Berlioz, a book on a guy called Jean Jacob, who's presented as the sort of dean of the human race. And it parallels very much what you've got, and it might be useful to look at other countries in the final version of what you do with this.
Yes, sure. Thank you, David, for your very useful tips and comments. As for the ridicule of these very old centenarians, yes, of course, that was the case. But what I found, I think very much like you found that during the 18th century, people started seeing this in a much more positive way. And what I see in the Netherlands and these Northern European countries is that these tales about centenarians, they sort of explode, and also in a very positive way. So there is talk, for instance, about Scandinavia, about couples in Denmark and Norway who marry while they are over 100 years of age. And it's not just one couple, but 3 couples at the same time. Or hundreds of people of 100 years and older visiting a large place. And I know that in the historiography, and I work on a corridor with historians of social and economic history, and they always tell me, but Rina, you can't possibly believe these stories are true. And I always tell them, it doesn't matter. It's not, the question is not whether these stories are true or not. It's about the conceptions and the ideas that are behind the stories. So I just picked out 3 of these aspects, and tease is one of them, and the myth of poverty and the advantageous poverty, which says something about the culture of old people and where they come in. And it's not only about old age, but also, of course, about society that surrounds them and values these people, or values the aspects of old age. So definitely these 2 aspects, ridicule and positive valuation, are there, but I see positive valuation much more in the 18th century.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rina. Does anybody else want to ask a question? I'm not.
Mary, can I? Yeah, can you see us?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much for these 3 fantastic papers. And so what I've taken away from your various approaches is that we really need to be beyond the dichotomy between the social imaginary on the one hand and the physiological process on the other. So we need to fine-tune our critical lens by adding the historical perspective, an ontological perspective, the cultural and the social to the physiological dimensions. And of course, this means that you need to look at broader questions. So for example, Dana made the point of the connection between how we perceive old age and individualism, which is of course a deeper connection to modernity as a driver of a particular form of how to grow old in a positive way. And that connects back to Rina's paper, because I think there's a deep connection to the Enlightenment context and the positive reinterpretation of very old age, by contrast to, for example, Durer's portrait of the old toothless woman who is associated with avariciousness, which is an old trope in the representation of old age. So Dana, I really liked your point about the notion of the body as not just the individual body, but the body politic, the social body, and other forms of performative embodiment and, of course, gendered embodiment that come into this. So what I'm saying is that really what your papers have shown is that these other dimensions really complicate the narrative around aging. And I have a question for Des, actually, with reference to the skin and this, your interpretation of these 2 old men, one African and one non-African. And you said that the African man looks younger. I'm not sure that this is the case in his own culture. I think that it's possible that in his own culture, he is perceived as an old man by younger people. So I would say that your interpretation of skin is latently influenced by cultural frames.
I think you're right. I think that's a very good point, because the totality of that person's contribution by that age would be much more evident in their personhood than just the number of wrinkles they have on their face. And I think that's a very good point. It was more just to indicate that the geographic spread in terms of our definition, at least within the physiology sense. You know, you see commercial products talking about the 7 ages of the 7 signs of aging, whatever, and they go through them one after the other in this fragmented, detached sort of way. But you're absolutely right. The totality of that individual's communication will be much more nuanced than just the amount of facial change in terms of wrinkling.
Thanks very much, Des. We are sort of, whilst late, we still have maybe a couple of minutes if anybody else would like to come in. I think just to add to what Anna was saying, I think it's so clear from all of the papers and from the respondents that aging is and always has been a contested space, and discourses around age and aging are not, there might be a clear direction of travel, and I'd refer here to Paul's the poem that you put up, Paul, where evil is the word that age is associated with. So the direction of travel is perhaps not positive, but it's sort of an area of contested meaning, and it's up for negotiation, and it is deeply historical and very much connected to specific social and cultural contexts. I suspect no matter where, you see a great displacement. So where you see positivity, the negativity that is sort of sucked out of that positive image, whether it's, oh, regenerating your teeth or whatever it might be, it gets put into something else, some other symbolic space. You know, the fourth age, the nursing home, as Paul pointed out. So Dana, I think you want to come in, so I will stop speaking. Please speak.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all. It really is wonderful to have a multidisciplinary group here, and I want to give you a shout out, Desmond, because I think the physiological pieces are really important, and it is always an interaction. In anthropology, we always joke around that the answer to everything is a biological or cultural. It's always both or malaria. So we need that here. And I just wanted to make a quick comment to connect back to Rina's paper, because David brought up teeth and smiles. There's a really lovely evolutionary explanation for those regenerations of teeth. I'm an N of 1, but I had impacted wisdom teeth, and our molars come in as we age because they can't come in. We don't have full-grown jaws as children, so we get 6-year-old molars, 12-year-old molars, and then many of us get our wisdom teeth at some time in adulthood. If I had impacted wisdom teeth, if I had been living 500 years ago and lost a tooth, my teeth would have moved around within my gums, and that impacted tooth could have found his way out. So it's just fruitful to have us all here together, to kind of have that mixed perspective. So it might not have been just a made up story or a bit of magic. It really, oftentimes magic really happens. Sometimes we can document it physiologically and sometimes we can't, but that really long time depth and having the biology there, though, as a very malleable component is critical. So.
The wisdom teeth is a good explanation. Another one is that the teeth of people were pulled out in rather crude ways. So very often the roots were left behind and would work their way up in later life, which is a kind of painful explanation.
And I see that Anna says there in the chat that Goethe's teeth were held in by wire in his old age, and he was in excruciating pain. Of course, there's a lot of paintings about tooth removal that look horrendous, and there's usually a huge bottle of whiskey involved and a string and so on. So I think just from a time point of view, I'll bring this panel to an end. Thank you so much, everyone, for these really excellent papers that are speaking to each other in so many different ways. Thanks to the respondents also.
I'm coming from the University of Limerick virtually. And the first speaker this afternoon is Andrew King, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of Surrey.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present today and giving an opportunity really to sort of share thoughts on how gender and identity and sexuality frame aging. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon really sort of draws on an article that I published last year and co-wrote with Catherine Almack. It was for a special issue of the International Journal of Aging and Human Development. The special issue was called Global Aging with Pride, International Perspectives on LGBT Aging. And we were asked to contribute a sort of UK perspective. And in the article, we sort of focused on 3 key areas of LGBT aging research in the UK over the last 10 years and talked about some challenges and future areas of research and the things that come out of that research. But I also wanted to use today as an opportunity to reflect on that paper and what we wrote in light of more recent projects and developments as well. So in writing the article, we drew on our experiences of running a project called Older LGBT People Minding the Knowledge Gaps, which ran in the mid-2010s and involved over 250 people, academics, policymakers, LGBT community organisations and community members. And from that, we published an edited collection, which you can see there in 2018. But as well as that, we also reached out to 17 leading academics in the UK, representing a range of different disciplines, and asked them really what they felt were the most significant issues facing older LGBT people that they had found in their research. So we focused on sort of key areas since 2010, and 2010 is important in a way for 2 reasons. First of all, there was a sort of start of a second wave of research about gender identity and sexuality later in life. So a sort of a lot of projects, a lot of PhDs were started around about that sort of time and came to fruition over the last 10 years. But also another significant sort of date of 2010 is that it was the Equality Act. So this is where equality legislation in the UK was brought together in the Equality Act. And that promoted equality and sort of outlawed discrimination on a number of characteristics, including age, gender reassignment, and sexual orientation. Obviously, 3 things very important to older LGBT people. So in our article, we focused on 3 kind of key areas that research had pointed to that was significant over the last 10 years. And that's identities and difference, health and social care, and housing, and that's what housing either with care or without care. So one of the sort of key factors, I think, or the key areas of research was really to kind of challenge ideas about the LGBT acronym and its applicability later in life, and also to think about the significance of differences and diversity, and how in policy and legislation, a focus on LGBT can obscure differences within and between LGBT people, amongst other intersecting identities and sources of social division as well. So in the article, we discussed a number of those different sort of projects that had focused, if you like, on areas of difference. So Jane Tracy's important work about the experiences of older lesbians and how older lesbians are often hidden and marginalized in LGBT discourse and LGBT research. Similarly, with Rebecca Jones and Catherine Almack's work about bisexuality and bisexual aging, and also important differences in the experiences of bisexual men and bisexual women as they age as well. And Ruth Pearce's work on trans aging and how, you know, sort of ideas about the life course are challenged by trans people's experiences, particularly when they transitioned. And so Ruth gives the example, or an example of somebody who transitioned earlier in life, and how that was different for somebody who transitioned later in life. And that calls into question issues around temporality. Within this sort of area of research, there's been a strong influence of intersectionality as a concept to understand multiple differences, but also to highlight the point that although intersections between aging, gender, and sexuality have been explored, and also including social class, intersections with ethnicity are still under explored, under researched, and under theorized. So another area was health and social care. And again, I think it relates to what we've already heard a bit about today, particularly the role of the medical profession in pathologizing the early lives of LGBT older people, and the kind of legacy, the ongoing mistrust of that in health and social care services. Also projects looking at the role of health and social care institutions in reproducing norms around gender identity and sexuality, so cis heteronormativity, and how that shapes LGBT people's experiences of health and social care services. There are other projects that have looked at ways to improve understanding for the health and social care workforce, and there's been quite a lot of work with practitioners around producing trans-positive care and toolkits to engage residential care workers. Catherine Almack and others have done a project about the sort of challenges faced at the very end of life, about what happens to LGBT people at the end of their lives, and those particular challenges that they face. And I was thinking particularly about what Paul Higgs was saying earlier, and thinking it, you know, really what that points to is the othering of the others, and how people are often very marginalized and hidden later in life, at the end of life. And then finally, with housing and with or without care, residential housing is a real key area of concern for older LGBT people. The phrase sort of being forced back into the closet is often used. So people having to hide their identities, their selves, and also experiencing discrimination in care homes as well. Some social housing providers are more inclusive than others, and some have actively engaged in projects to try and overcome issues around discrimination for older LGBT residents. But there's two things here I wanted to also point to. One is about the graph, which in a sense is pointing to issues about trust and being comfortable in your own home and who you let into your home, and how LGBT people have often got concerns about who comes into their home later in life if they have to have service providers in their home. But also, and the quote there, very much the kind of microaggressions that people have to deal with on a daily basis as well. We also looked at various challenges in understanding the lives of older LGBT people, and we pointed to certain knowledge gaps, particularly around ethnicity, but also trying to understand more about issues around gender identity and non-linearity. the need for other theories and methods and methodologies to be used, and to kind of expand our theoretical and methodological frameworks that are used in LGBT aging research. And also we discussed briefly some of the social political contexts. The sort of coming of Brexit, what that would mean in terms of a changed political climate, and also an economic climate, but also the rise of populism and people's concerns about that, and the rolling back, if you like, of progress. So reflecting on the paper now, I think, over a year later, it's interesting to see how things have changed both in my own thinking and in light of other projects and developments. So I'm also involved in another project that's been running for the last couple of years and runs until the end of August next year, which is looking at intersectional life course inequalities amongst LGBTQI+ people in 4 European countries. And it's a multi-partner project, and thinking about the points about non-linearity and the kind of effects of chrononormativity, temporal norms on LGBTQI life courses, and how LGBTQI people often experience their life course differently because of chrononormativity. Another aspect is really thinking about how generations and generational thinking is making a bit of a comeback. And so we hear an awful lot, of course, about baby boomers, but thinking about the need to kind of queer generations, how for LGBTQI people will have different sorts of historical events and cultural events that will have impacted on their generational thinking. It's important to factor that in as well. And also LGBTQI people have been engaged often in various forms of activism over the course of their life. Not only the kind of spectacular activism of certain groups, but also the kind of quotidian everyday activism that comes from living a non-normative life and the challenges that that brings. And so trying to think about how people are bringing that activism into their aging as well. And then
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you, just going to give you a time reminder. You can finish the next couple of minutes. Thank you.
I'm just about to finish. And also thinking, obviously, of course, about COVID. There are a number of studies taking place at the moment about the effects of COVID and the pandemic on LGBT people and how that is going to shape aging. But I think it's important that we wait and see, that we don't rush to conclusions about what that might be, and we explore both the complexities of that and then think about the legacies of that more longitudinally as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll go to your respondent now, Desmond O'Neill, who's Professor of Medical Gerontology at Trinity College Dublin.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Hopefully you can hear me well enough. Good. First of all, I'll try to stick to my 3 minutes, a very rich and complex presentation. Really enjoyed it. And I've been interested in this area for over 30 years, first coming across this as GSA in 1987 in San Francisco. And what fascinates me are the opportunities for learning for the broader population of older people and indeed the lifespan, issues of gender and sexuality, and indeed trying to unpick the common perceptions often as later life as a time of asexuality. And I think that what our interest here and what interests and excites me, and I think all the scholars and other people here, is the opportunities for scholarship in humanities. And I suppose starting perhaps with media studies, I think within his last slides there, we really got this sense perhaps of latching on to the activism aspect. And I think this activism aspect is potentially a strong one, and I'm going to come to it in intersectionality and its dangers. But a nice study I heard in the Journal of Aging Studies looked at Canadian media studies of how older LGBTQI were portrayed. And it came out in 3 strands. One was the invisible. The second one was very much relating to past injuries, as we're aware of and covered. But the third one was of role models and icons. And I think seeing some of the strengths and opportunities, particularly for academia and scholarship, are located with an advocacy focus that perhaps we don't see to the same extent in terms of identification in later life of older people. I think through film studies, and I think in particular a focus down on movies such as Pedro Almodovar's Pain and Glory, a really eloquent focus on aging, where for a gay man really gave us a sense of this second wave and acceptability and normativity. And lastly, I think if we look at literary studies, and here I think the history of these various waves of understanding are important. If we look at Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, and indeed the really challenging way in which aging and sexuality in later LGBTQI life is portrayed. So where can we go to and where can we bring it? I think it's to look at the opportunities arising out of intersectionality. But my one concern sometimes, and I'm not the only person perhaps in the room to be thinking this, is the danger of intersectionality, particularly in public health, where it's being seen as something to tease out inequalities. And it seems to be quite deterministic in its perceptions and scope, that these are various attributes or markers of, albeit due to the asymmetric power structures, they're markers of challenges and weaknesses, and they seem to perhaps not to incorporate adequately agency, whereby people resist, and what way would they resist an injustice, and what we can learn from advocacy. I think the other challenge, and again, I think this is where I really enjoyed this presentation, is the issue of who chooses what's included in intersectionality. So I think it's about understanding that even within advocacy and within the various groupings and categories we might be talking about, there can be hierarchies of structure in their own right. So I think lastly is one of the things that troubles me generally, for example, in studies of loneliness in later life, is a failure to include the rest of the lifespan as well, knowing as we do that loneliness peaks between the ages of 15 and 35, and the danger of caricaturing late life is the time of loneliness. And I think really what's important here is to look also at the similarities of LGBTQI aging and the rest of the population. And for example, a nice study by Kindal around retiring at the same time in same-sex couples, which is something we've really only been able to learn from the Swedish data up to now. So strengths and opportunities, certainly a rich, vibrant and exciting terrain of scholarship. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Des. I'm going to move straight on. If you want to put some questions or comments in the chat, then we can keep an eye on them during the afternoon and maybe bring them back in at the end. So on to Wendy Martin. Great to see you, Wendy. If I'm right, Wendy is in the Division of Health Sciences. She's a sociologist at Brunel University in London.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this excellent symposium. It's, as Julia said earlier, we're always very interested in the multidisciplinary ways of framing age. And what I hope to explore in this paper is look at some of the interconnections around gender, aging, and the body, and particularly in the context of everyday life. And what I'm presenting today comes from a journal article that was published this summer in Sociological Research Online. Obviously, I'm just going to give a little essence of it in the 10 minutes, but hopefully I'll give you a sense of what we argue about how gender and aging intersect and how they are performed and represented. in terms of everyday life. And I'm going to focus on hairstyling and dieting, although we also talk about clothes and beauty work in the paper. And the data is drawn from the project Photographing Everyday Life, an ESSC project. So pre-COVID, although I might say something about hair and COVID. So to give some background is, I think the focus of our work is really about the significance of the everyday and how the everyday can be really central to how people, as they're growing older, understand and experience ageism and sexism. And I'm just focusing on those two in terms of this paging. So aging presents very particular gendered constraints, and I think Julia spoke about that earlier, and also talked about how the materiality of bodies and the corporeality of bodies and the physicality of bodies as they change, but recognition of how that interconnects and interweaves in terms of a culture and how we are also aided by culture, and the social cultural meanings that are attached to our bodily changes are significant. And one of the areas that we often consider is how older women in particular negotiate what's often described as the invisibility paradox, how as you grow older, you become invisible. At the same time, all that is seen as your body is hypervisible, and it's this invisibility paradox that we'll come back to. And the other idea that we looked at in the paper is the sense of becoming. And the body, the doing and the practices of the body are a series of events that continue in the process of becoming. We work and rework and continually flux and change in terms of our body and remake our bodies throughout the life course. And we'll talk about more. Sometimes this is often, and I know Paul Higgs has described it in terms of fitness. Fitness is, even for the top athletes, isn't anything you achieve, it's something you're always becoming. And that's kind of where the sense of the concept comes from. But just briefly to say that we spoke to 42 women, 20 men, who did photographs of their different routines for a week, followed by a photo elicitation interview. So the first theme I'm going to sort of talk about in this sort of sense is around hair and hairstyling, and how the aging body is performed and presented and represented in many ways through hair. And here, and there's many objects around this and many practices. And from nearly half the women, remembering that the focus of the research was about everyday life, the hair was a significant part of their everyday practices and routines. And they talked about them and the fact that they illustrated them through the visual images. To some extent with men, I'll say a little bit about more of that in a moment, but much less so. It was much more the women that really talked about the hair. So here we have Francesca saying, "Oh, I put my hair in curlers and so that have the hair dry it on and different ways that through the day she would be arranging and rearranging her hair, depending on where she was going and who she was going to see. So it's not even a fixed thing. Hair can depend on the context as well." Grey hair was really significant in this sort of context. And here we have Hannah, who talked about coming out as grey. Thinking about, the fact that it was actually a process she thought about, and whether she was going to change, instead of continue dyeing her hair, whether she's going to come out as grey, which is quite interesting because obviously following Andy's paper in many ways and the meanings of coming out. But then she changed her mind because she actually felt that people saw her differently with grey hair and how competent she was as a person. So it went into a sense of subjectivity as well. Or Francesca here talking about when she goes to the hairdresser, she doesn't want to go to the hairdresser when she's got an inch of white roots. And I suppose, I think this was really heightened, I think, when we were all in lockdown, is, the presentation and performance of hair and a lot of choices people made before, during and after lockdown was quite significant around this as well. And of course, your sense of how you feel. Here's Victoria talking about how she had just come back from the hairdresser. She was feeling really good, and then she got a letter from the pensions, and then she felt much older. So it's a changing and influx feeling and sense of identity. For the men, I could put some images here with the men. They did talk about it, but mainly around beards, mainly, occasionally clipping their hair, and objects like some shampoo. it was talked about in a different way. So the second area we're going to briefly talk about is around dieting and weight loss. It's interesting when body weight was discussed, it was often featured in terms of the transcript. It was quite offhand in some ways. And women often talked about food, and then for some, they then expressed this shame and comments about their body size. And there was this sort of sense of surveillance and discipline, and disciplining the body in a continual process, and the pressures of both men and women. As you can see, Thomas here felt more pressure to lose weight. Now the scales here are quite interesting in the sense that we only had one set of actual body scales, but that was a man who weighed himself every day. But underlying these sort of narratives around the body weight was this sort of a kind of confessional discourse. So you hear first Catherine saying when talking about scones, oh, it's okay because they're not too fattening. Or you have Maria here sort of, oh, that's my shopping. It's probably, talking about her photograph, probably a naughty luxury, I should think. I'm a lot fatter than I used to be. And the reason I've highlighted or bolded the words at the last two quotes, what's very interesting in them is Julia talking about butter and not having sandwiches because it could do with losing the weight, or Verity talking about the range of sizes and an expandable waist. So quite often the comment around body weight would come at the end of the sentence. It would be added on in a sort of way. So just to add a few concluding comments, the focus of the everyday brought into for the social and bodily practices that were routine and repetitive and the habitual. So the findings from this are really very much about the body has experience in terms of the dailiness and habitual and the routinized in terms of everyday life. And the participant generated images and narratives, so when they talked about them, were gendered in terms of how the aging bodies were understood and represented. And we also talk about this is about how the methodology, the photographs do this as well, but I haven't really talked about that. And so what we're sort of working towards is saying that the body is actually in a process of becoming and it's bent. It's in a continual changing bodily project that is worked upon. And sometimes, particularly the older women, seem to be caught up in this cycle of forever becoming, this like a state of impermanence. They're waiting and indeed working towards this sense of their sense of self and their embodiment. They're always working upon themselves in terms of their body work and discipline in order to become. So that's where we could argue about the sense of becoming. Of course, the significance of these participant negotiations and sometimes resistance to these dominant ideas and discourses surrounding gender and aging and the body were significant in them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Just straight on now to our respondent, Zainabu Jallo, who is a PhD student in Bern University in Switzerland.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Anne, and for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of this constellation, which I find very remarkable. Thank you so much as well to Wendy for your wonderful project and paper. I read it thoroughly, and it brought my mind back to a project I had started myself in photographing older women and in different cultures and societies, and the kinds of inequalities they dealt with. And I couldn't help but think back at what it meant to, well, what it means or meant to grow older in some African cultures that I am familiar with, where the graying hair is actually celebrated rather than hidden. And in such societies, you know, age discrimination would probably be felt more by the younger groups than the older generation. And older women in such traditions are often revered as repositories of knowledge and skills, and almost regarded as near sage-like women who are filled with wisdom, and men, women all consult with them. So it actually brought to mind that cultural beliefs inform social norms and values around aging. and the role of older people and these norms do change as societies evolve with a myriad influence. And of course, now in such societies, you have phrases like, oh, you don't look your age, or aging is certainly not construed the way it used to be anymore, just based on all sorts of influences that come on board. And through this feminist structuralist lens, which is preoccupied with the construction of gendered subjectivities, your project is clearly an intersection of aging and sexual inequalities, arguing that meanings of aging and gendered bodies are fixed but not constructed. And this point is emphasized through the concept of becoming, which I find quite interesting. And becoming, as you describe it, is a state of impermanence in which older women are waiting to become. If I understood your project well, this act of becoming is waiting to be visible. I don't know if there are many other connotations to the act of, or to the point of being seen or to become. A question I'd like to follow up on is what to become connotes in this sense. And it also brought to mind anthropologist Tim Ingold's notion of the human, where he proposes that humans should be regarded as verbs, as beings, and not becomings, because there's no fixity to being human. And even if this were the case, we have biological factors to contend with in not being, to be fixed is to be frozen, and to be frozen is to not exist at all. So this act of becoming is something that both young, old, male, female deal with at all times. And from the participants, we actually see the vulnerability and the pressure internalize in a way that even if it's not coming from without, they put this pressure on themselves to become and or to be visible in a way. And based on my own project and working with your text, I became a bit critical, wondering if this is not a form of ageism coming through the back door itself. You know, the idea of following the lives of the aging and their quotidian activities as though, especially with body walks, dyeing the hair or wearing makeup or going on diets. I believe these are activities that other people who are not in that age category could identify with as well. So is there a point where this becomes, strange that people that age engage in what would be normal activities for the rest of us? That was one question I wanted to put out there. And quite interestingly, a couple of years ago, you know, there was a point in your paper that talked about the silver fox against the aging woman, you know, where they are more celebrated and seen as, and are more visible than older women. A couple of years ago, some luxury brands decided to have older women in their ad campaigns. It was called the Grey Power ad campaign, and it was met surprisingly with a lot of cynicism, mostly coming from older women too, who claimed that aging women were just being used as targets for sales, that there was no way an older woman would actually feed into luxury brand advertising and all of that. So
Nabu, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I need you to just finish off your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, very much so. I'm just rounding up. So my main point is wondering if this is not just another form of ageism itself, but I really do find your project quite interesting, and I look forward to talking to you more about it during the hour of conversations. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much, Wendy and Zainabu. So moving on to our final speakers of the day. So Susan Pickard, who is the Professor of Sociology at the University of Liverpool. You're very welcome.
I just want to start by saying, in a long-term sort of sense, I'm interested in the way that understandings of both gender and sexuality as both concepts and lived experiences are very much constructed with the earlier portion of the life course in mind. And also, in a very real sense, old women are ejected from the gender system and as sexual subjects, as if it were natural. So that's locating where I'm coming from here. But the paper that I'm going to read, which is called The Last Love Affair, exploring how the double standard of aging shapes women's sexuality in later life, is, again, unlike many of the other speakers today, it's a work in progress. I started writing it a few months ago, so I'd appreciate any comments that anybody has, because it will help me. So, in a way that works exactly counter to that of midlife masculine rejuvenation via the youthful love affair, in this brief paper, I will explore how the double standard of aging discourse is deployed for women via, among other things, the last love or last affair. It's a frequently occurring trope in both fiction and memoir, by which women see themselves and are encouraged to see themselves in terms of one last vivid blossoming of sexuality before the dropping of the curtain on youth and youth sex. My aim is to demonstrate how this trope serves as a heuristic through which women learn what the sexual double standard of aging is and how it works, which separates them from their earlier life, as well as from those women who are younger than them. And to do this, I draw on a range of novels and memoirs that are both contemporary and more classical to illustrate my points. I won't have time to do much, obviously, in this. So, in brief, the sections that I'll cover are, I'll first look at how this kind of impulse for the last affair is perceived, anticipated, and experienced, and the meaning given to it in the context both of aging and of their life course more generally. After this, I explore how the double standard is normalized in and through this trope. But I then consider it as a rite of passage in which there is a sense of leaving something behind, but also of arriving somewhere, and which may have more positive elements than is reflected in and through the concept itself. And I'll finish with a few reflections on ageism and the age and gender regime more generally, as well as on the nuances of the double standard, and on the role that other theoretical approaches, such as queer theory, can play in resisting or reconceptualizing what is, of course, indeed a very heteronormative discourse. So again, all of these will be very briefly covered. So I'll do my best, though. So firstly, in terms of the last chance love affair, how it feels to want to seize it, I suppose, and what it means and represents to women in midlife, which is anything in these novels from early 40s to 60s and 70s. So here is how Sandra Singh Low describes it in her 2014 memoir, The Mad Woman in the Volvo. And this is her time, age 46, when she had a huge desire for one more love affair, which comes upon her while she's at the Burning Man Festival. How interesting, but as it turned out, she says, that at 46, I wasn't entirely done. There was one last man on earth I truly wanted to sleep with. In a moment, perhaps this desire would be forgotten. And on Sunday, the temple with its dead letters and wedding dresses would be burned, as apparently they do in the Burning Man ceremony. Then Monday would be Monday, Tuesday would be Tuesday. Life would continue as usual because my youth was over. So this is characterized by a sense of loss as much as potential, of backward-looking nostalgia as well as forward-looking hope and yearning. Another example, Robin Rinaldi, embarking on a search for last love in her early 40s, nevertheless at 42, wishes she was 10 years younger. For fertility, she feels, is a marker of two phases of life, one containing potentiality, the other loss. And she writes, I'd have given anything to be 32 again, with 10 years of healthy eggs left in my womb. For in my mind, regardless of childbearing, that biological marker, formed the dividing line between the first half of life, when every moment thrilled with potential, and the second half, when even the best moments harboured a seed of loss. So now going on to how this trope, this experience of this idea of the last love affair normalizes the double standard as part of its kind of hidden agenda, if you like. So women's narratives also reveal how the lived experience of passing through the last love affair is one way in which the double standard of aging is embedded in women's consciousness, and in many cases, albeit painful and regrettable, at least initially, accepted as natural and inevitable. This is strengthened through comparison with older and younger generations, as well as with peers. So my example here, I can't resist bringing in Simone de Beauvoir. I'm going to use her protagonist in her autobiographical post-war novel, The Mandarins, Anne Dubroy, I think you pronounce her surname. And she sees her friends as mirrors, and she traces their loss of beauty and their loss of love accordingly. Anne's friend Paula, for example, has lived for love, and now that is eluding her on the basis of her age. She writes, Paula, or she thinks, the character in the novel thinks this, Paula had been so beautiful that it never occurred to me she would one day cease completely to be so. There was something in her face that would resist, I thought, and suddenly you could see, like everyone else, it was made of spongy flesh. This is rendered all the more poignant when Paula's lover, Henri, couples up with Anne's own young daughter. The trope of the last love affair and the double standard of aging it enshrines structures Anne's reflection on her place as aging woman in the sexual regime. For example, when Anne begins on her last love affair, which is how she sees it, by the way, with the American Louis Brogan, in reality, this is based on Simone de Beauvoir's lover, Nelson Algren, and in fact, in reality, it turns out not to be her last lover at all. But anyway, Anne reflects on her hopes for the continuation of this love affair. Harassed by time, she allows herself only a little glimpse into the future. Thus, freshened by a new coat of makeup, my reflection in the mirror was satisfying. No, 6 months from now, I shan't have aged much. I'll see Louis again and he'll still love me. However, at the very end of the novel, she begins to lose confidence in this. She sees herself as aging, and there's a harrowing scene in which, after ending the affair, Anne is so depressed about the passage of time and her entry into old age, although she's only early 40s, remember, that in a long dark night of the soul, she comes very close to killing herself. I might say contemporary versions of this novel, I don't have time to go into. Just to show, however, that this trope is enduring, you could look at Helen Walsh's 2014 novel, The Lemon Grove, and it uses comparison with her daughter to make the same point, or Jane Allison's novel, Nine Island, written in 2016, in which it is her mother's fate that she wishes to avoid, among several others. I'll quickly go on to Last Love as a rite of passage, because feminist novels or the autobiographical perspectives of powerful and self-assured women writing suggest that, contrary to this negative message, there's something very liberating beyond youthful gender roles, and for which the last love affair very often serves as a rite of passage. Kate Brown, and protagonist of Doris Lessing's early 70s novel, The Summer Before the Dark, is the classic example of this. Again, its themes continue to reverberate in contemporary texts. So I'll just quickly delineate what these themes are. So in this novel, Kate finds herself unneeded by both husband and children. She's around 45. She decides to age in her own terms. The vehicle for this agency, which, by the way, it's a great assertion of agency in a way that Kate has never felt before, well, not since adolescence anyway, but the vehicle of this is embarking on a love affair. However, this just helps her gather herself together to re-individuate, as it were, outside her identity as wife and mother. And following an intense bout of self-assessment, a change in her appearance, particularly focused, contrary to Wendy's findings on actually letting her hair grow grey and deconstructing the feminine masquerade, she emerges as an older woman in a very positive sense. But I'd like to say that agency here is presented not just as conscious, rational and logical thought. It is as much led by the body and the changes of the body, and it is also guided by the unconscious and the psyche in the form of powerful dreams. And of course, and Dana will attest to this, non-traditional cultures take the role of dreaming in such states very seriously, where we don't. And there are many other contemporary novels which take these themes, and one of them is Sandra Lowe's novel that I've mentioned before, that have very, very similar themes with a more contemporary kind of concrete examples depicted in them. Okay,
Susan, sorry to interrupt you. Just going to ask you to come to a conclusion in the next couple of minutes.
I'm coming to the conclusion now. So, in this brief presentation, I've tried to sketch how the last love affair trope is one of the ways in which women are aged by culture, using Galette's words, sooner and more viciously than our men. A methodological reflection here is that, as a sociologist, literature is not a mainstream resource. I like to use literature because I think it's a source that you can find, rich and nuanced stuff that you probably couldn't find if you interviewed women very easily, but it's often frowned on by sociological journals and has to be carefully justified, particularly in kind of mainstream sociological journals. But it does reveal that kind of paradoxical kind of stuff that again, Wendy has alluded to, the fact that women contradict themselves and both aspects are true. A couple more points, if I may, Hilary. One of the reasons for this paradox, of course, is because the double standard of aging as a theory is simplistic. And Clary Krekula has talked about this because, of course, men experience vulnerabilities with aging and women acquire strengths and advantages. So there is that, we know that. But nevertheless, in terms of dominant cultural notions of sexuality, the depiction is both ideological, powerful, and does, for good and ill, shape women's experience of aging, even as they see themselves resisting or rejecting it. I was going to talk a bit about how queer theory can be a useful tool for understanding this process outside the conventions of heteronormativity, but I guess I've run out of time, so I'll just end here. Thank you. Well, if I was going to say one thing about queer theory, I'd like to say that just the point that Paul made as well, I find often that when queer theory centralizes theories like Judith Butler's famous gender performativity, it kind of sidelines the body. And what I'd like to do is use queer theory, but make sure the body has a central role, because embodied changes and embodied realities of aging are important, but I'll say no more about that.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Thanks very much. So our final speaker, and then we'll have maybe just about 5-10 minutes for conversation. We'll finish at 5:45. So over to Gillian Pye, Associate Professor of the UCD School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hilary, and thank you very much for the invitation today. It's been fascinating to hear all these papers. So I think that Susan's paper shows that exploring a last love narrative as a heuristic that shows how women are aged by culture is a really powerful and very persuasive approach. And I think that even in the 10 minutes Susan showed us, there's a very rich fund of material ripe for reading through the lens of a critical gerontology. And literary material, and Susan alluded to that, opens up the perspective on individual lives, on inner lives, that's difficult to access perhaps from other quarters, but it also opens up the insights into the kind of the technologies, the mechanisms of the imaginary, if you like, the metaphors, the scripts that shape our experiences. The challenge, of course, of deploying a literary text as heuristic is to contextualize it so it's understood as a cultural, historical, poetic construct. And the blurred boundaries between memoir and fiction add an extra challenge to this, the need to articulate the relationship between lived experience and narrative. So a general question that I would have, and which I think Susan's paper kind of touched on, is the relationship between the genre characteristics of these texts and the time in which they were published. How do they draw on their historical context, and what happens when they're brought into dialogue with one another? And I thought it was very interesting that Susan identified Sandra Ting-Lo's text as a kind of contemporary variant of Doris Lessing's 1974 novel. So it isn't possible, obviously, to cover all of those kinds of things in a 10-minute paper, but I think that Susan's reflections offer a way of thinking about how fictional and how semi-fictional texts use narrative devices to reveal the assumptions shaping lived experiences. And of course, that's not a one-way street. It's a kind of a dialogical process there. On reading the paper, on listening to the paper as well, I was struck by some of the metaphors used in the argument and identified as well in the primary texts. And in the minute that I've got left, I just want to identify two of these and use them as a way of organizing some questions that might be interesting to discuss further. So I'm going to throw out a load of questions now and hope that that's an okay way to approach this task of discussant. So one of the things that Susan touched on was late love or last love as marking a divide in the life course. And we've been talking quite a lot about divides between different periods of life today. And in the longer version of her paper, which I was lucky enough to also be able to look at, she used the metaphor of the bridge between sexual and post-sexual phases. And the bridge is interesting because as well as being a link between here and there, it's also a place within its own right. So it points to, but it also problematizes a binary. So I'm interested in asking, how do these late love narratives navigate this kind of fuzzy terrain? How do they balance the fact that age is performed, age is constructed, but also, and we've mentioned this a few times today, it is an experience that's bound in some senses to a binary, to a kind of biological point of no return, certainly in certain cultures. I'm interested in the metaphors that are used to express this kind of liminal state, and what are literal or embodied experiences of transition, of liminality, and what are rather metaphors. The Burning Man Festival as a kind of temporary community outside of the everyday world, I thought was a very interesting example. It asks us to think about the relationship between the fictional trope and the lived experience here, and what does that tell us about age as embodied and as cultural.
Lillian, I'm going to ask you just to sum up now, if that's okay.
Yep, I had one more thing that I wanted to say. Can I say that?
Sure.
About mirror. So I just want to raise the question of the mirror, which is a recurring metaphor in the presentation of particularly female identity throughout fairy tales, films, visual art, and it ran through so many of the examples in Sarah's in Susan's paper. Sorry. So I think it would be interesting to think about gaze. How is that directed? How is it redirected? How does the mirror get us to think about self-reflection, doubling, authenticity, the idea of the psychic age of multiple aged selves within one person, and the way in which others are used and deployed in the construction of that gendered self. And obviously the Lacanian kind of mirror stage is a very operative psychoanalytic perspective as well. I'll stop talking now, but I just want to say thanks again very much, Susan, for the paper. It really fired my imagination and my curiosity, and hope some of those ideas are of some use.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gillian. I just want to end all of those speakers by saying what a fascinating and rich and deep combination of presenters we've had this afternoon, and so much we could talk about. We have a very short amount of time. If it's okay with you, I'm going to keep going until 10 to 6. So we'll have about 8 minutes of questions and comments. So can I just invite anyone who wants to make a comment to raise their hand?
I just wanted to reflect on the fact that I think it's difficult for us to make a final comment, because in fact we've had such a wonderfully diverse range of comments. I've got a whole series of things I'd like to raise here, but in a sense they're running after particular points raised by the different papers. So I think if people are quiet, it's because they're thinking and because there is just so much to think about.
Yes, and maybe we could invite people to contact each other individually if you want to continue conversations. That might be more useful than squeezing in a few minutes of discussion now. Well, I might turn to Anne to close the afternoon, to say a couple of words.
Okay, well, I mean, I think we can stay with the silence and give people time, attempt to digest, because it's been such a rich afternoon. So maybe somebody does have a comment. I've just been thinking about this afternoon, and what I mean, there's so many different strands, but perhaps what holds it together is the power of the collective unconscious and how it permeates our scripts, the way we see ourselves, the way we position ourselves in the social world. And so even when we try to resist the normative frames that structure life up to a point, there's still a pervasiveness of these unconscious frames that guide us through life. And I was particularly struck by the misogynist lens of de Beauvoir, yeah? Who is known as a feminist, as a proto-feminist, if you wish, but who is so misogynist in the way she looks at women in so many different ways. I don't have a conclusion, of course not, But I was also struck by how well the format of brief presentation and the interlocutor, the respondents, has worked. The respondents have put a lot of work into their responses and raised really serious issues. I've taken copious notes, so I'm hopeful that we can return to some of these issues that have been raised. I like the idea of the notion of the bridge, the liminal state, the function of the mirror, all these issues that have come up with reference to various papers. So let's take it forward to our next webinar on the 15th of December. I think we will learn from this. We'll get to know each other better. I have to say, I've done many of these now, and I find them fascinating and frustrating at the same time. And the frustration is that you always see everybody close up, and yet you are so far away. That's kind of, a strange experience for me, and I'm struggling with this. So I want to thank you for contributing in so many different ways, and I look forward to continuing our conversation with you next time. So thanks for staying on and for being patient with all the technical glitches and the delays and what have you. That's always part of the online format. And thanks so much for so many excellent papers and thoughtful responses. We have a lot to take forward and to consider. That's all I have to say. And I wish you all, I don't know, what time is it, Dana, with you? Nice afternoon or nice day. And for the rest of us, a nice evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to the 15th of December. So thank you very much, and bye-bye from me.